Hello, this is Professor Lakatos. I hope you're having a good day or a good evening, depending on when you're viewing this video. In this video, we're going to discuss how to prepare a professional memorandum under various settings. Specifically, our journey is going to involve the following areas. We're going to look at the uses for memorandums, the different types of memorandums, the memorandum format for the different types and different settings. We're going to dive into the components, each component of a memorandum, and walk you through the several types of memorandums. So I've got some really good examples that you can learn from and use as prototypes, so to speak, for your future projects. Then I'm going to drive home several important points to remember when preparing your memorandum, and more importantly, when you do any writing. And then how to sign off on your memorandum. That's the most happy part of this process, is when you put a lot of work into writing a memorandum, especially a multi-layered memorandum, as we will talk about shortly. You feel really good. It's a great process to go through, and when you get to sign off on it, you feel very accomplished. And now I'll make some closing remarks before I sign off. There are two main uses for memorandums. Generally, they're used in a business setting as well as in academia. And I'm going to look at the differences between the memorandums that are used in business versus education. And then there are different types. What I like to call a direct or straightforward memorandum, a multi-layered memorandum which has various components to it. And then if your memorandum becomes lengthy and has a great deal of analysis in it with exhibits and multiple sections, you might want to think about turning it into a report. And I'll show you how to convert it into a report. It's not too complicated. First, let's look at the memorandum header. And you would put memorandum at the top of the page, centered, all caps, bolded. Okay? Then leave a couple of line spaces between the heading memorandum and the actual header itself. And notice in the header you have to, from, date, and then regarding. This is your subject matter of your memorandum. And you want to make it succinct. You do not want your subject matter to be too long, so keep it nice and succinct. Notice that each of these items are aligned, okay? You don't want them to have a different setup. So align them nicely like this, and you'll see that in the memorandum examples I give you. Now, depending on what setting you're using this for, you may be writing this to a client. You may be writing it for a manager or some supervisor or for a professor. Now, you want to put the name of that person in the to section, obviously. Then you want to put your name in the from, or if you're doing it as a consulting firm, for example, on behalf of a company. Okay? And I'll show you how to sign off on this later on at the end. That's our happy moment. And then use the date the project was completed. And why do I say that versus when the project is due? Because it will show the person that you're submitting it to when you actually completed it, and if it was ahead of time, that's going to look good. It doesn't mean to say that if you put the date the project was due, that's going to look bad. They're probably not going to know the difference, but having the date that you completed it, if it was a couple days before, gives a signal that you are well prepared. Use a completely written out date. So spell out December, for example. Don't use the number 12 for the month. Spell it all out. You want to be very formal in these memorandums, as you will see later. I've got some points to make. As an example, don't use contractions. Don't use can't or wouldn't or didn't or isn't. Always spell out your words, and I will remind you of that shortly. Well, the direct or straightforward memorandum, we're going to take a look at it on a little bit bigger screen than this, but it's generally up to a page and a half, 2 pages max, where you do not need multiple headings. As we'll talk about in a little bit, you don't need an executive summary, and you don't need a multi-layered format. It's very direct. Usually direct or straightforward memorandums are a page or a half a page long. So the memorandum heading is the same as we showed before, but notice there's no special headings in the body. This is the body of the memorandum. It's just very direct. If you have to convey something simple. And here, what's being conveyed is a consulting project that's being issued by a manager to his staff, for example. So it's about a page and a half long, giving them the facts to a degree, but the prelude to this memorandum is the staff had a meeting about this with the client and was supposed to take good notes. So the manager is just fine-tuning what the issues are for them to analyze and put into a multi-layered memorandum when they're done to present to the manager that ultimately will be presented to the client. So the manager is going to review your analysis in a detailed multi-layered memorandum and hopefully sign off on it. If not, he or she will send it back to you with edits that he or she wants you to make. You make those edits, sign off on it. Hopefully he or she, the manager, signs off on it and gives it to the client. So that is the direct or straightforward memorandum. Again, as you can see, it is shorter. It is right to the point. There's no extra headings or layers in it. Now let's dive into the multi-layered memorandum, which is what most of you are going to want to concentrate on, especially in business settings where you're doing a very detailed analysis, or in an academic setting where you're asked to analyze a case study, for example. And I will walk you through both types. Now, before I dive into each component of a business memorandum, what I want to do here is just give you a general sense of the overall structure, and then we'll dive into each section, each component, and then I'll walk you through actual examples. So as you see here, we have the structure for a business memorandum. We have the executive summary right there, and notice the title is centered. It is bolded, but it's not all capped like we did with memorandum on top. Your executive summary should highlight your findings, and I'll go through that in a little bit. So we'll dive into the components one by one, but I just want you to get a general sense of the structure in this particular section of the work. Now notice how the headings are set up for the different sections. Section 1, we use a Roman numeral 1. Was Kemp's a good candidate for an activity-based costing system? Well, this is where you're going to dive into analysis. And as I will demonstrate later, you always want to have some kind of a paragraph in between a main heading and subheadings, because it's the paragraph that's going to introduce your analysis. It's going to be your lead-in to your subheadings. Now notice your subheadings, different than your main heading. Your main heading is bolded, okay? It is left justified. Now these are rules that are used by business professionals, particularly the New York Times rule of business writing. There are other rules of business writing that follow the same approach, okay? So again, your main heading is bolded, left justified. You want to have a transitionary paragraph or paragraphs that lead into your subheadings. Notice your subheading here is italicized. Remaining subheadings are indented further. So notice your first subheading is indented once in. And then your next subheading, again, because you're multi-layered, it's a good way to break up your analysis. It makes it very readable by using headings to the extent needed and to the extent possible. And sometimes you don't want to have too many headings because it can get confusing. You need to have meat behind the bones, so to speak. If there's enough meat to create a separate section, either a main section or a subheading, well then I recommend using more headings. Okay? Now notice again, each main heading is bolded, and we use Roman numerals to differentiate them. And then you'll have your conclusion, which I'll discuss in more detail shortly. And the title conclusion is bolded and centered, just like executive summary. And I'll explain the difference between an executive summary and a conclusion in a little bit. But this should give you a sense of the overall structure of a multi-layered memorandum for business. Now on this next screen is a memorandum for academia, for when you're particularly using or analyzing case studies. Because you notice down here at the bottom, we have under the executive summary a case synopsis, which is an added component for the academic memorandum. In the case synopsis, you're going to highlight the facts that are in that case study that are a good setup for the rest of your memorandum. So in your analysis of your memorandum, you will be using facts or referring to facts in the case study to apply concepts and theories and rules, etc., to reach an overall conclusion. So the case synopsis should contain those key facts that help set up your analysis. And I'll go through that again a little bit more shortly, but now I want to dive into the components of a multi-layered memorandum for business, which is basically all the elements in academia minus the case synopsis. So first, we want to talk about the executive summary. And as mentioned and showed before, you want to center the title executive summary, bold it, but it's not all caps, it's just initial caps. In the executive summary, envision this. An executive is working in a big city like Atlanta, and they're headed to a meeting and they're in a cab or Ubering it. They're going to need to get a sense of what your memorandum is about and highlighting your overall findings, so that if they want to dig deeper, let's say they're familiar already with the client and the factual situation, they won't necessarily need to dig deeper if you give your overall findings if they're really, really busy. Okay, if your findings get them more intrigued and maybe they're not as prepared as they thought, they're going to dive into your analysis deeper. So that's the notion of an executive summary. That's not to say the executive summary or the executive is not going to read your entire memorandum, because you're going to have supervisors above you that are going to read it in detail. So if those supervisors have signed off on that memorandum, the executive, the top person going to the client, is going to trust that that memorandum was prepared in good order, that it was done professionally. Okay? However, again, the executive needs to know the details. They'll be right there for him or her during the meeting to reference to. And he might even be able to or her call a timeout. Maybe use the excuse of going to the restroom if he or she needs to dive deeper. But hopefully there'll be enough time on that Uber ride to review your entire analysis. Or you can envision someone on an airplane who's going to read your executive summary, and then by providing subsections or subheadings and main headings, they can see how well organized it is, and they can get right to the issues that he or she wants to deal with first or right up front. Again, the executive in most instances is going to be well aware of the situation you're analyzing. So again, the executive summary is a highlighting of your findings as written for a business executive who may or may not have time to read beyond the executive summary. Okay? The executive summary should be intriguing enough to cause the executive to read on, though. So even if they don't have time, they may be getting out of the Uber and feel compelled as they're walking into an office building to read it in the elevator going up because they're getting into it. That's the key. Now, the executive summary can be 1 to 3 paragraphs in length, depending on the length of your analysis. Now, keep this in mind, and I'm going to reinforce this rule. Paragraphs throughout the memorandum should be 3 to 5 sentences in length. And that's according to the New York Times rules of business writing. And that is used very much in training seminars for staff managers, executives, lawyers, accountants, etc., writing seminars. So you want to keep your paragraphs fairly short, not too lengthy, for a couple of reasons. If you're transitioning from an idea to another, that's a point where you want a new paragraph. Also, by having shorter paragraphs, it makes the document more readable. It actually relaxes the reader to see shorter paragraphs because they go, wow, this looks pleasant to read. Because a lot of times it is about appearance. So keep that in mind. It helps in the structure and organization of your memorandum to keep your paragraphs at that certain length. It also affects the reader when he or she first looks at the memorandum. If they see long paragraphs, they're automatically going to go, I got to read that. So think about that. It's kind of like when you walk into a room for an interview, your first impression that you make in the first 10 or 15 seconds, that's when the interviewer is going to judge you the most. And that's unfortunate. And there's a lot of research out there that demonstrates that people judge you in the first minute of meeting you. It's the same thing with the memorandum. When they look at it and gloss at it, they're thinking, wow, this looks like it's pretty tight and good to read. But if they gloss at it and see mistakes, they see long paragraphs, they see it's disjointed, they're going to already be having a negative attitude in their minds, consciously or subconsciously, as they're going through it. So keep that in mind. First impressions are very important. Now, the body of the memorandum is after the executive summary, and that's where you begin to use your main headings and ultimately subheadings, depending on the depth of your analysis. But the body contains your analysis. It is the heart of the memorandum. Okay, it's the meat of the memorandum. So your analysis should be organized using headings and subheadings as shown. And again, I'm going to give you some really good examples shortly. Okay, so stay tuned for that. And again, remember, paragraphs throughout your memorandum should be 3 to 5 sentences. We're going to talk about grammar and spelling shortly. There are no excuses for having improper grammar or spelling mistakes in a memorandum. And I've got a good rule to help you with that. Now, the conclusion. This is the key part about a conclusion. Your analysis should lead your reader to your conclusion so that when they get to the conclusion, which may contain recommendations by you based on your analysis, they should already be sold. They should already kind of know what your conclusion is going to be. They should already know what your recommendation is going to be because your analysis was a strong lead up to it, and you may have hinted out to those recommendations in your analysis. So, for example, in a memorandum I'm going to show you shortly, in that scenario, the analysts, those that prepared the memorandum, recommend specific ways in which the company they're analyzing could be more proactive in managing the challenges that remain in the company's implementation of what's called the balanced scorecard. That is a managerial accounting tool. Right? So the strength of their memorandum was their analysis. And by the time you got to their conclusion, you were already sold. It was clear as day as to what those recommendations would be because they demonstrated the need to actually implement those recommendations in their analysis. Okay, so again, strong analysis leads to a slam dunk conclusion. So remember, you want to wow whoever's reading this. Draw them in. Bring them to you through your thought process that ultimately leads to your conclusion. So let's look again briefly at the structure for a business memorandum. So this is one of the examples that I was referring to before that I would show you, in this case, of a business memorandum. So now you can see the structure in more detail. And notice again, your header is standard, to, from, date, and then your subject matter regarding. Now notice here, I have a capital E here, and before I had a small e. It's going to depend. Some people put initial cap 2, capital T, small o, capital F, and then the remaining letters small. it depends on preference, okay? So it's okay either way. I don't think there's anyone that stringent on that particular detail. Now notice again, you have your executive summary, which highlights your findings. Okay? Again, wanting to draw that executive in, the reader in, to read the rest of your memorandum. Now notice, as we go through it, notice how the structure is set up. This particular sample shows us how it is multi-layered. So as we scroll down, we see that we have a main heading. Notice it's bolded. And then we have a subheading. Okay, here that's italicized. However, what's missing, so in these samples, I purposely leave out what's missing to demonstrate the difference. Notice there's no transitionary paragraph between this subheading and this subheading. So that is more appropriate, and it would look a lot better to the reader and actually help tell the story better. It will help your analysis better. So in between here, this subheading formation of subchapter S and scenario 1, you really need a transitionary paragraph. So as we scroll down more, we'll see again how it is multi-layered. Again, there is another subheading there as we continue on, and notice they embedded an exhibit within the memorandum. Now you have another choice there. You can put your exhibits at the end of the memorandum, but you will want to make reference. Like you want to put in here, parentheses, see Exhibit A. Okay, if you're making reference to, let's say, the income statement. Okay, and I'll talk about that again shortly. Notice again, we're now into section 2 of the memorandum. Again, multi-layered. Now this is a lengthy memorandum, and we're getting into numbers and detailed analysis here, but look how nicely organized it is. It's appealing to read. It's not overbearing. Okay? And there's another section, section 3. There's actually 10 sections, I believe, in this memorandum. And each area is broken down again with subheadings. But notice here, there's no transitionary paragraph. Tax consequences of operations. Well, why not talk about those operations a little bit, make some highlights, not just go right into the numbers. Okay, give some highlights of those operations, those financial figures, and then dive into this table here that has taxable income. So again, have transitionary paragraphs in between main headings and subheadings and sub-subheadings. It's very important, even if it's just 1 or 2 sentences. But in this situation, after this main heading, the writers really should have given like a brief summary of the section, highlighting their key findings, almost like an executive summary within a heading, within a section. Okay? Lead into, tell a story when you write a memorandum. And as we scroll down, we see again more and more analysis. Okay? Again, this one lacks the transitionary paragraph between the main heading and the subheading. So that's something to work on. And hopefully you see the difference. You can visualize the difference. Because when we go back up here, we can actually see a transitionary paragraph right here into your data. Okay? And we even see one here, a transitionary paragraph prior to your subheading. So between your main heading and your subheading. It appears better. It also tells the story better. Now, one thing I want to point out, and I purposely left it this way, is notice here the writers probably should have taken more time away from this memorandum because they've looked at it so many times that they didn't see some mistakes. So, for example, here, there should be a page break. You've got a subheading that's sitting here by itself, and then on the next page, you dive into that section. Well, there should be a page break there. That is a natural section for it. So make sure after you've drafted your memorandum and revised it several times to sit away from it for a little while. You've got to factor that into the planning of your memorandum. You need some time away from it so you have fresh eyes, so you can see that, like here, you need a page break, or that you're missing transitionary paragraphs, or let's say an exhibit is not lined up correctly. It gives you fresh eyes on it. It also helps to make sure that you check for spelling. Don't necessarily rely on Microsoft Word's spell check. It isn't always correct. It sometimes misses things. So you've got to go through it with a fine-tooth comb. And I'll talk about that again shortly. Now I've jumped down to the conclusion of this memorandum to point some things out. This memorandum is 13 pages long. That conclusion is too short. It's too short because there were 10 different sections in the memorandum, 10 different issues. Right? Some of them blend together. So the conclusion really should have been at least a couple of paragraphs. So you can have a conclusion that's 1 to 3 paragraphs, and it's going to depend on the length of your memorandum. And you're bringing your reader to your recommendations. Okay, so that's important. So notice here, say make a recommendation on the type of entity that this company is going to choose, and then they make some other recommendations, but they don't go into enough details here, and given the length of their analysis. So your length of your executive summary, the length of your conclusion should match your overall analysis. Again, you don't want it really longer than 3 paragraphs for both the executive summary and the conclusion. But what's the difference between the executive summary and the conclusion? The executive summary is going to give a little more meat. It's going to highlight more of your findings and also state your recommendation, if there is a recommendation, if appropriate. Whereas your conclusion is founded on your analysis, and you're actually bringing the reader to your recommendation or your ultimate conclusion. So the executive summary entails your conclusion in part, a little more succinctly, but also does a lead-in to your overall recommendations and highlights the findings that are in your analysis. So again, it does more, the executive summary does more than your conclusion. And you don't want the way you wrote your conclusion, i.e. the recommendations, for example, to be identically written in your executive summary. Find a different way to write it. You don't want to be cutting and pasting. So that completes our demonstration of the business memorandum structure. Now we're going to dive into the academic structure once again and give you an example. And as noted earlier, the primary difference between the business memorandum structure and the academic structure is the case synopsis. We're simply adding a case synopsis. Now, I want to make a special note here. In a business memorandum, it may be appropriate to add a client summary underneath your executive summary. And what do I mean by that? If there are a lot of facts related to a particular client, let's say you're doing estate planning or financial plan, or let's say you work at a hospital and you're writing about a particular patient. Well, you might want to provide a couple of paragraph summary of the important facts related to that client that are important to your analysis that the executive may or may not know, or whoever is reading it may or may not know. So again, even though I didn't put it in before, if it's appropriate, having a client summary or a summary of the facts is important. And that's what a case synopsis is. It's a summary of the key facts that are in a case study or a situation that you're analyzing. Maybe you're analyzing the financial situation of Nike, different than a case study that you've been given, like a Harvard Business Review case study. You're actually doing your own work, going through their annual reports, looking at articles online, and then you're going to create a composite case synopsis. Okay? That again is a summary of the facts. And to hit it home one point here, so you can see it visually, again, the case synopsis. Highlight the facts of the case that are a good lead-in to the rest of the memorandum. So if your analysis makes reference to facts, the reader's not going to know about. So set it up in the case synopsis so it flows into your memorandum and the reader will feel more comfortable, more knowledgeable when you're actually analyzing those facts. So let's take a look at an example of an academic styled memorandum. Okay? What's missing here on this first page? The header, right? We don't have memorandum at top in all caps bold. Okay? So that's important. So hopefully you noticed that. But notice the header, everything is lined up nicely. You keep your subject matter relatively short, direct. Okay? I would have written a description a little bit better than this. Rather than Volkswagen do Brazil memorandum, I would have taken memorandum out. I would not have put this here. It should go at the top. So I'll demonstrate some other areas that need improvement, but overall this memorandum is very good. So we want memorandum at the top here. Okay? So we definitely want to make sure it's all bolded and at the top right there. And notice we've got a well-organized executive summary. It's 2 paragraphs, okay, highlighting the key findings. And then we jump into the case synopsis, which gives a summary of the facts. Well, given the length of this particular case study, it was about 18 pages long. They probably needed another paragraph for the case synopsis. Okay? They made it a little too succinct. But notice right after the case synopsis, we jump into the main section of the first main section with a Roman numeral number 1. Okay? So far so good. Now in between main sections, I recommend putting 2 spaces here, 2 line spaces to create a bigger gap. Notice in between your main heading and your next paragraph, you do a single space. So let's go into a little more details about that. Notice we used single space between paragraphs. We had an extra space in between paragraphs. So inside a paragraph, it's single spaced. In between paragraphs, we add a space. Most memorandums that I've seen don't indent the paragraphs. Okay, that's a matter of style. Okay, I prefer it this way. Okay, that's the way I've seen most memorandums written. But notice in this one, it's a nice transition because there's some additional analysis that needs to be provided as a lead into the subheadings that come into this section. So very well done here. And notice there's another subheading and on and on. Okay? And notice again, good job of providing a transitionary paragraph as a lead in to this section on strategy implementation. So notice the difference versus the previous memorandum we looked at. Now, when appropriate, you're going to want to provide references in the form of a footnote or endnotes. Generally, with memorandum style, footnotes are generally more helpful because you can see them right there, and that feature is available in Word. So I recommend using footnotes. However, you want to provide a list of references, if used, at the end of your memorandum, at the tail end. Now, what do you notice here in section 6, down at the bottom there? What should they have done? Well, they should have created a page break here. And that does not look right. So this team probably gets a little bit of a demerit for not taking a little extra time to be away from the memorandum, fresh eyes. And I'll talk about that again shortly. Here's another example. What do you see here down here is there's no Roman numeral attached to this section or the letter A as a subheading. If it's a subheading, it should be indented, italicized, and not bolded. We don't know what it is. And notice there's a gap here between this part and the next page. So when we look at the next page, that really could have been moved up. Okay? So again, it's about appearance. It looks like that you didn't care enough, or these preparers didn't care enough with these attentions to detail, or attention to detail. And that's really important. Attention to detail is critical. Your supervisors, your clients, an executive, they're going to notice these things right away. And if it's a manager or a professor, they're going to make notes, and it's going to affect your grade. It's going to affect your performance evaluation at work. So make sure attention to detail is something that you become very, very tuned in with. If it's not something you have, work on that skill set. It is super critical in today's business environment. Attention to detail. And avoid using texting language, and get away from the mindset of texting when it comes to business writing. You want to be thorough, succinct at times when needed, but you want to be thorough and you want to focus on those details. And notice here we have the transition into the overall conclusion, which they make recommendations in. So that's our look at an academic type business memorandum. Really, it just adds the case synopsis. Okay? And the whole goal is to apply the concepts that you've learned in a particular course to an actual situation, a real world situation, and take your analysis and lead your reader, the professor, and maybe students to your overall conclusion. They should be sold by the time you get to your conclusion. Okay, let's go over some important points. Some of them we've already discussed, but they're very important as reminders, and then there's some new ones. Throughout your memorandum, you should use single line spacing inside paragraphs. 2 spaces between sentences throughout your memorandum. You want 2 spaces between sentences. Now notice I spelt out the word 2. For numbers 1 through 10, you need to spell them out. So 1, spell it out. 10, spell it out. Anything above 10, like 11, you can write the number 11. That is a proper writing rule. Okay? So notice I spelt out the word 2. You want double space between paragraphs. Remember, I mentioned earlier, when you're going from one main section to another main section, add that extra space, add that extra demarcation. It looks better aesthetically. It also shows that separation between main sections. But between a main heading and a subheading, just add that extra line. Keep the length of your paragraphs to 3 to 5 sentences. So notice I should have written 3 and 5. I should have spelled it out, but it's just a little bit shorter here. But you should have picked that up. So you want 3 to 5 sentences. 6 sentences is okay as long as it's not lengthy. You want to be able to keep your ideas succinct in smaller paragraphs, and also makes it more appealing to a reader as they're going through your memorandum. It pulls them in. It's not just the way you write and your overall analysis, it's also appearance. Okay? Perform a spell check, but don't just rely on the spell check. Rule I always print out, and I recommend you do as well. Print out your memorandum. Just don't look at it on a screen. You see things better when you look at it on paper. It's just the way your eye and brain will naturally work. I know you'll probably enjoy reading it on the screen, but you won't always capture things, especially things like page breaks. Okay, that's going to be important. You won't see the big picture unless it's out there in front of you, just the way an executive, a manager, or client, or professor is going to read it, okay, most likely. As a professor myself, and as a consultant and a former executive, I like seeing things on paper. You also want to do a grammar check. Think about, as a student, if you are a student, to use Grammarly, or even as a professional to use Grammarly if your employer will support the purchase of Grammarly. At the university, we use Grammarly, so look into it. Okay? It's a great way to tighten up your memorandum and make yourself look a lot better. And you'll also learn from Grammarly. Be sure to proofread your memorandum several times. Here's a big rule. You must factor in some time to proofread it with fresh eyes. Don't try to finish a project, whether it's in academia in a business setting, minutes before it's due or half hour before it's due. Factor in. Best rule is either you're going to lunch and being away from it, or I like the rule, sleep on it. Let it sit overnight and look at it fresh the next day. If that's feasible, if that's possible in the timeline. You always want a fresh look at it because you'll miss things like those preparers missed the page breaks and those large gaps between a paragraph and the next section. Okay? Check for overall appearance. So think about that rule. Always manage your time where you have a cushion to look at it with fresh eyes. Definitely emphasize that in your notes. Remember that in your careers. As mentioned before, do not use contractions. Always spell out your words, right? Do not, cannot, is not, would not. Professor, spell it out instead of PROF, period. Okay, spell out your words. That's very important. Here are some more important points. Support all of your statements and conclusions with good analysis. And also, if you're going to refer to a fact, you may want to consider writing a client summary if it's for a business memorandum. If it's for an academic memorandum, make sure your case synopsis contains all the pertinent facts that are going to be referred to in your analysis. Set up your analysis well. Provide references, as noted before. Use footnotes if appropriate. Okay? Footnotes are the best because they're right there for the reader, and it gives credibility to your analysis. Use exhibits for figures, tables, charts, etc. Exhibits are great illustrations. They are great visual aids, and it shows an extra effort made by you. They should be placed at the end. As noted here, you want to make reference to them in your analysis. So as written here, if you write in the company's income statement, in parentheses put see Exhibit A, and on and on. So that's important. If you're going to use an exhibit, you got to refer to it in your analysis. Exhibits are well loved by managers, supervisors, executives, clients, and professors. And one more important point to hit home. If your memorandum is lengthy, so it has significant sections and analysis, like the one we saw that was 13 pages, you may want to consider putting into report, which basically takes that memorandum heading and now you convert it into a cover page, rather than using the memorandum heading. And then you want to create a table of contents, okay, that shows your executive summary is on page 2, for example, because your cover page will be page 1. Your synopsis or client summary will be on page 2 as well. Maybe it's page 223. And then your analysis, break out each main heading. You don't have to do subheadings per se in your table of contents, but in your table of contents, you want each main heading to have a page setup. What page does it start on? And then your conclusion. Okay? So a table of contents would be very, very helpful. If it's a lengthy memorandum, again, convert it to a report. And here's what's provided on Microsoft Word as a sample cover page. You can put in your document title, and then I would put the preparer's names down here below in the lower right-hand corner, or if you want, you could put it centered and a little bit higher. It's really up to your style. Include your date, not just the year. So you want to spell out the date. Maybe you want to put that under your names. Like here it says pick the date. Okay. The cover page is up to your creativity and make it appropriate for the setting, whether it's academic or business, for a client, for a professor, or for a manager. Okay. And you may want to even include an abstract of your memorandum there, which could be very similar to your executive summary. Again, it's going to depend on the type of project you're working on. And remember again, most important rule of all, I think, remember to leave time for a fresh look at your memorandum. Plan for this in your time budget. We focus on details. Us reviewers, whether a client, manager, or professor, we look at the details. Okay? Analysis, the organization, i.e. structure of your memorandum and its overall appearance are key. Attend to those details. Because here's what happens. When you look at it on paper, you see these mistakes more than you would looking on a computer. So take the time to look at it on paper. Now, with it all complete, you've looked at it with fresh eyes, you get to sign off on it. So next to your name, you put your initials. And that is the best part of it, because you got this. You got this. You can do it. And definitely let me know if you have questions. Reach out to me using my campus email. And I want to thank you for your attention and time, but I want to hit home a couple of important points for me when it comes to being a professional. Professionalism requires effort. It requires discipline. It requires an attention to detail, a passion for details, a passion for wanting to wow people. Again, people judge us in the first minute or so of meeting us. The same thing goes with your writing. Make it look good. Make it read well. Demonstrate your superb analytical skills. And if you are down on your writing skills, work at it. You have it in you. You've got the gift. Make every day matter. Because every day does matter. As in a professional, we make the most of every day, not just in our careers, but in our personal lives. Thank you again for your time. Have a great rest of the day.